Welcome back to the channel, guys. So we're doing the second episode here of the Kendo Kata first person kind of analysis and exploration, talking specifically about the mechanics of the kata, very much suited to Dan levels. So if you've got Shodan and progressing from there, and even for mid-ranking levels, maybe you don't practice a whole lot of kata and you're looking to sharpen it up, you might get a few tips and pointers here. Just a side note, this is all based on my experience it's my own analysis, but also under the guidance of the teachers that I've encountered. You may encounter some bits of advice here that differ from what you're being taught. If that's the case, just follow what your sensei says. There are different interpretations to the kata in the minutiae, but maybe you'll find something of interest here and of benefit. Okay, so we've explored Ippon-me through Sanbon-me in the first episode, so this one is going to go from Yohon-me up until Nanahon-me of the tachi forms, the longsword forms. Okay, so Yohon-me, the waza is essentially ski kaishimen. Okay, so the way this works is Uchidachi steps forward, taking haso no kamae with the left foot forward. This is a bit like, some people call it indoor jodan. So if you can do hidari jodan, bring that down so that the tsuba is sort of level with your cheek, thereabouts. Okay, with a 45-degree tilt on the sword out to the right and backwards over your shoulder. That's roughly. Some teachers have vary on that a little bit, that angle, depending on how traditional they like it. From there, Uchidachi advances 3 steps, but this time Uchidachi and Shidachi, when they advance their 3 steps, it should be measured steps, not as big as you would usually make them for all the other kata, so show some restraint. Okay, and the reason for this is that Shidachi has taken wakigamai. They've hidden their blade behind their body. You don't know what they've got and how big it is. It could be a nodachi, right? That's the feeling, right? In the old days, when swords were made bespoke for swordsmen, they would be to personally tailored lengths. Okay, so this kind of carries over from that, and it's considering that situation. They've hidden their sword. You don't quite know what they've got. You don't really know what kind of waza they're gonna do. So there is a little bit of caution in terms of advancing to the center line, and they take a similar approach. So yeah, you meet a little bit short of where you would usually do, and then something happens, which is basically both players, essentially, they try to call out the other person's waza. So there's a big lift into furikaburi, and they both cut men at the same time. And yeah, I think it kind of represents that thing of, okay, well, I'm going to force the issue, but both players go to a stalemate. But it's a case of what happens if the stalemate is up high. Okay, and so there's this cut, and then this also helps Uchidachi set the distance for the waza of the kata. So then there's a fight for center, and they both gradually bring their swords down, and it's a bit like number 3. No one really quite wants to let it get to chudan. So as they're coming down, Uchidachi pulls the trigger and goes for a ski, but this time the ski is turned. Okay, so the angle of the blade is turned horizontally to the right. Okay, flat like that. The idea being that it needs to slip between the ribs. Some sensei like a slight downward angle on it. Some sensei like a slight upward angle. Some sensei teach it kind of straight. I think any of those are okay as long as there's not too much tilt. Okay, but generally speaking, most of the teachers I know teach it with some tilt on it. Usually most of them are slightly pointing upwards, but I've heard numerous interpretations. So Uchidachi makes the ski using okuriashi, okay? And they're aiming for the knot in your gi. So you step forward, okuriashi, make the ski. Shidachi catches the ski, basically makes kaishi waza, turning the blade down and bringing their grip up through the center and guiding the blade closely along their side, guarding their door, their hip, their shoulder, all of that. Okay, so the ski is guided gently past to your right. As soon as that is achieved, as soon as their Kensen has gone past your body and you're safe, you should lift up to Furikaburi position with the bokuto above your head and make a nice big large strike. The footwork step out is left foot comes out and forward diagonally, and right foot comes behind it. Okay, so you're cutting men with your left foot leading. Okay, changing the angle by around about 35 degrees. From there, Shidachi can simply drop their sword back down to a chudan position as Uchidachi steps back and takes chudan. You can then step in to the right using your right foot and then bring your left foot in behind it to assume chudan, and you should be back on the center line. So, things you can do in terms of controlling the waza, or a lesson I think that you can take away from this, is, you know, we don't really see this kind of waza as it is in the kata in Shinai Kendo anymore, but we do have that moment of clashing and going into taiatari, and it often becoming tsubutseriai. So I think for me the lesson of the kata is, if your first cut fails, you need to keep kigamai and migamai. Kigamai is you got to keep your awareness of your spirit for what's going on. You got to stay with the encounter, and your migamai should show that. It should reflect that. So your posture, you should be putting yourself into the best position to deal with the next encounter. So for me, that's the lesson of the kata in a lot of ways. And so that's why there's more than one strike, you know. So there's this amen, and it's like, well, what happens next? Don't give up fighting. You're still fighting. So that battle for the mai and that battle for center line, control of the center line, is still ongoing. You need to stay sharp, stay focused. Okay. And now you're at a close-ish distance. So it's also a little bit about, okay, waza selection. Like, what are you going to do? At a close distance, ski is on. Okay. If you're kind of like that door distance, around between sort of door and kote, you know, skis on. So you need to be aware of that. And yeah, it's just about, again, keeping cool, controlling that center line, and yeah, making the appropriate waza. Shidachi's footwork is stepping backwards. So the right foot goes ayumiashi backwards, and you assume waki no komai. Your sword should be angled 45 degrees down. The blade should be hidden behind your body. This is important, but try to keep your left hand towards the center. You may only be able to rest your bokuto on your fingertips of your right hand to achieve this. And you can put your right hand open palmed essentially on the top of your backside, really. That's the feeling. And this will support the weight of the sword, but this will give you a rough idea of how to hide the sword. Okay, and the curvature of the blade should do the rest. Don't try to over hide it, because the tip will stick out the other end and they'll see it. Advance 3 steps forward using ayumiashi, pushing off with the back foot, so it becomes left, right, left. Go through furikaburi, lifting the sword nice and big above your head. Make your men strike, the I-men strike, bringing the right foot through and forward. Make you get scared with the left foot, so that this puts you in good kamai. Make the play for center, coming down. As the ski is made, you're going to catch the kaishi as your left foot steps slightly out and forward. Make this a small conservative step. You don't need to advance towards them, they're coming towards you. Okay? But the feeling shouldn't be of one retreating. It should be of advancing. But you need to show a lot of control here. You'll know if you mess this up because your men cut will be too deep. Okay, so if you step too far forward, your men cut will be too deep. So that left foot comes out and forward. This is where you catch the kaishi as the right foot snaps back into place behind the left foot in normal kamai. This should be timed to make kikentai no ichi with your cut. From there, you gently bring your blade back down to a chudan level. This will be quite close to their face. You bring your right foot out and forward towards the right to step back onto the center line. Put your left foot park that behind it as you would in normal kamae. They'll step back to the center line and you'll meet in Chudan. Make kamae otoku, and 5 steps back, then make Chudan, ready for gohon-me. Okay, so for gohon-me, we start in obviously Chudan. Uchitachi takes hidari jodan no kamae, just as you do in ippon-me in the first kata. Uchitachi, this is now a different scenario because the player on the other side in the shidachi position doesn't assume jodan. They have a much more measured response. They're in chudan no kamae, so it's a good example of how to fundamentally approach a chudan versus jodan scenario. So, briefly, just to summarize, shidachi is in chudan, but it's a slightly different variant of chudan. So, what you do is you take a slight hanmi, slight twisting of the body with the right foot edging forward slightly from your normal chudan kamae. So it's not strict heel to toe, okay? And there's an important reason for this, which is basically you want to angle your kensen to just outside of their left fist, okay? Some people will point it directly at the left fist, that's okay as well. The hasuji should be angled slightly out, open hand, okay, for shidachi. Basically you want to have the right hasuji to cut their kote, okay? And the idea is that you're, from a distance, you're already letting uchitachi know, I'm looking at that kote, okay? This is important because this is how you generate your initial seme, okay? Both players advance their 3 steps, okay? Uchitachi takes a normal kind of 3 steps that you would do as you have in all the kata except for obviously Yohon-me, where it's shorter steps. So it's 3 large steps right up to the center. Shidachi does something different. It's 3 steps ayumi-ashi forward, but the very last step you don't do 100% of the distance. You probably hold back about 20% of the distance. Remember, you're in hanmi. There's a slight turn on your body, okay, with your kensen aimed at their kote. So you're going to use that extra distance that you've got from the twist in your body to engage them, but you're keeping your, essentially what you're doing is you're keeping your men back a little bit, but you're doing it in a subtle way. So the idea is that knowing that you've got the kote covered, you're essentially inviting a men strike. That's your approach. You're inviting a men strike. So this is the reason why uchitachi can cut the men, okay? But they need an incentive to cut the men. So the way I like to approach this is that shidachi, on that 3rd step, although you're holding back a little bit on the distance, I like to have that last step be kind of sharp in timing, okay? A little bit sharper than it usually would be. So rather than just a straight 1, 2, 3, yeah, to kind of thing, it's 1, 2, 3, and that you kind of cause uchitachi to pull the trigger, right? The idea is for most jodan players, and I can say this from personal experience, that if you feel your kote has been threatened, one of the worst things you can do is try to pull it away or block it in some way. Yeah, there are times where you can lift it out the way, kind of like ippon-me style, lift, step back and lift, okay? But actually, it has some vulnerabilities. If you get a bit overly defensive that way, that actually makes for a really clear ippon when you're doing shinai kendo, right? So if you step back and you do this and they do still strike your kote, that's 100%, that's definitely ippon. Whereas it's actually less likely if you're just in regular kamae and they strike it, unless the strike is really, really high quality, it's much less likely to score ippon because they haven't really demonstrated that they created a break in your posture. But if you step back and you defend, that's a clear break in your posture. And should they strike the kote, even if the strike is not 100%, it'll probably be awarded ippon. So that's an important understanding there. So knowing this principle, you seme in and basically challenge and threaten that kote. And their ultimate desired outcome is to cut the men. Basically, if you're in a situation against Jodan where you decide to actually go for that kote, when they cut men, their left hand is going to come through the center. So your kote is going to come here, but their left hand is going to move off that mark and come straight down the center. It's actually highly unlikely that you'll succeed in striking their kote. It's very likely that you'll come into their mai for debana men. Okay, so this is the thing you want to sell Uchidachi on. And this is what Uchidachi from the teaching side is kind of looking for, this understanding that you have. So this is a nice kata for a basic understanding of how to seme against Jodan for an oji waza. Okay, so Shidachi steps in with a bit of vigor on that last step, even though they're conservative with the distance, because they want to make Uchidachi kind of reach for that men and really commit to it. And using that momentum, you catch a suriyage, stepping backwards with okuriashi, and make the men strike going forwards with okuriashi. From there, you step back, pull the bokuto down to the eye height, again to demonstrate that you know where that cut is coming from. Some teachers explain this as, in this kata, in this sort of situation, they're likely to fall forward, so you would pull your sword back. I think there's possibly some truth in that. It's one of the interpretations I've had, but I also think it is just one of those basic teaching points. Again, it's you know, I understand where the cut would finish, and then you step back and assume hidari jodan. Okay, so when you make that men strike, you're in normal footwork. When you step back, you bring your right foot behind you, push off with your left to make proper ayumiashi, and make hiketsuke with that left, which is now your front foot. That's important, okay? It shouldn't just be that you swap legs. That's not going to make enough distance for you to demonstrate zanshin, okay? You'll be vulnerable to a door strike if you do that. So you need to make a significantly large step. So it's important that as you draw the right foot through to the back, that you push off with the left and make hiketsuke to achieve a good jodan no kamae, hidari jodan no kamae. So now you're a little bit over in Shidachi's side. So Shidachi will, when Uchidachi shows, when they recover their kamae slowly, that you're invited to return to Chudan. You make Ai Chudan, and then you've got to take 3 steps, small steps, to go back to the center where you started. And Uchidachi should take responsibility for drawing you back to the correct spot. Okay, and that's another point in this kata. It's very important, is that Uchidachi, it's their responsibility to look after and manage the distance. That doesn't mean that Shidachi just forgets about it. What it means is Shidachi does their best interpretation or performance of the kata, and should it be slightly off when it comes to the end, it's Uchidachi's responsibility to correct that. So if you took your 3 steps and you were slightly short, Uchidachi has the responsibility, or can take the initiative to say, I recognize we're not quite back where we started, so I'm going to bring you back an extra step. So if that happens and you're practicing your kata and Uchidachi does that sort of thing, just follow their lead. That's what they're supposed to do. And be mindful, because if they do that and there's has to be an extra step in the kata, you should remember that for next time and go, oh, okay, I'm not making big enough steps to return to the center. And where is that happening in my kata? Where is it going wrong? Was it during the waza, or is it just during the initial 3 steps forward? Analyze that, because it's important. You should have really good perception of distance, which is another thing that kata really helps you achieve in your kendo. So, as I said, the waza here is suriyage men against Jodan. But I think the main kind of teaching point is that this concept of what you're semeing, so where you're applying the pressure, which creates a set of opportunities, a somewhat predictable set of opportunities. From Uchidachi's perspective, if you're covering their kote, they only have a couple of options, and also if you're controlling the distance. So if the distance is very close, you can make the argument that, oh, they could drop down and also ski. But to be honest, men is much easier, a much more appetizing target for Jodan than ski is, because you have to change kamae to do the ski. And it has to happen in 2 movements, right? So men becomes then very appetizing. They can also hit men from further away. Your arms aren't raised as Shidachi, so they're not going to be able to strike door, right? Your body's a bit far from them to be able to strike their door, okay? So there's a few sets of parameters that kind of narrow down the options for your opponent. So if this was Shinai Kendo, and you took this attitude that Shidachi is taking against a Jodan player, this is a lesson in how to turn the tide, so, or put the odds in your favor, right? You're limiting where they can strike. So now you've got a good idea of where they're going to strike. Then you've just got to work on controlling when they're going to strike. And as I say, you're using this seme step, this third step being a little sharper than the others, to pull the trigger, okay? That doesn't mean that's always how you're doing it in Shinai Kendo. The point to take away is the principle of you need to create a situation where you know roughly what's going to happen, and then you need to try to create a situation where you know when it's going to happen, okay? And you use your body and your footwork and your kamae and your spirit that you project onto them to try to achieve this. And that, in a nutshell, that's what you're doing in Kendo, right? That's the basic premise of how you seme in Kendo. So this is a lovely simple kata to be able to study that a little bit, okay? Okay, so beginning with roppon-me, kata number 6, which is, the waza is kote suriage kote. Okay, this is an interesting kata because it's the first time and the only time where Shidachi makes the first move, okay? So the situation is Uchidachi is in Chura no Kamae, and Shidachi takes Geda no Kamae to essentially force the situation somewhat, okay? Geda no Kamae is a very defensive posture, but it's predicated on the basis that in order for your opponent to cut you, they're going to have to lift their hands at least a little bit. If they lift their hands and they step forward, there's always the threat from ski from below, okay? So that's the basic premise of what Shidachi is kind of got in mind here, okay? So that's the basis from which you're starting out. So Uchidachi and Chudan, Shidachi and Gedan, they approach with 3 steps. Now, Shidachi, this is very important. This is a study of taking the sen. It's one of the kata where you first practice this and you encounter this concept, and as you learn it and you polish it, you're able to go back and apply it to your other kata and obviously implement it in your Shinai Kendo. Hopefully by this point you're starting to implement this a bit in your Kendo anyway, but if you're not, this is a good place to start learning. So you take those 3 steps in. Shidachi takes that last step in with a bit of zing, right? A bit of extra momentum. And you should kick your kensen up, say just 10 centimeters is enough, just a little, just enough that Uchidachi will see it, okay? Don't break your kamae. Okay, this causes Uchidachi to be very aware of, you have some intention of being able to stop their fist, like cut their fingers, right, on the grip, or if they should make a big lift, that you would be prepared to commit to a ski, okay? So this makes Uchidachi suspect a trap, and they try to suppress your sword. So they come down with the tachi over yours, okay? And you start to come up to pressure theirs a bit and go, well, okay, if you're going to be cautious, then I'm going to look to recover Chudan. They don't want this. They want to keep the initiative, okay? So what they're hoping is that if they step back when the tension becomes unbearable, all right, don't rush this part. When the tension becomes unbearable, they quickly step back into Hidari Jodan, hoping that you will make a silly move and basically just step in with reckless abandon, at which point they would strike your men. But that's not what happens. What happens is you immediately seme their kote, which changes things. Now you're at a very close distance with the seme, so it would be very easy for you to hit the debana kote before they could probably bring the men down. At least it's a very touch and go situation. So Uchidachi immediately drops back and reassumes Chudan or Komai. Now as soon as you make the contact with the Chudan, you should push and seme like you did in Nanahon-me. If you haven't watched that video, I'll link it above, but go and watch that if you haven't watched it first. But you should push to your left slightly, so basically overpressure their kote. So it makes it, you know, if you both press like this and one person lifts, the other person's sword's gonna like swing to the side, giving them a chance to hit kote. Yeah, so push, it's gonna open the gate like that. This is the idea. So as soon as you meet an Chudan, make that pressure so Uchidachi feels that there's a chance if they strike quickly that they can strike the kote. Because there's only a small chance, and this is a more kind of advanced kata, they use a small kote strike. This is important, not a big one. So it's one okuriashi step in, make the small kote strike. Shidachi, that's where the call for ya is. Shidachi's response is to step out into the left foot slightly ahead of the right foot initially. Make the suriage, then bring the right foot in front, so reassume Chudan, but now you're at an angle of 35 degrees. But this changes your mai slightly, so it's 1, 2, right? Bam pam, and it's quick and snappy. Suriage small kote. Okay, then you're going to drive off with the right foot, push the left foot forward, and assume Hidari Jodan, make good hiketsuge. It's important that you make this step quite big. You drive them back with the kensen pointing at their throat, and then coming up to the eyes, and then into Hidari Jodan. And you should be almost looking over them when you finish, provided you're tall enough. If you're not tall enough, don't worry, just own it, right? Just make yourself as big as you can when you take Jodan. Okay? They'll step back to avoid being stabbed or anything. So, and they assume this sort of, you know, posture that shows that they're submitting. Okay. From there, Uchidachi will gradually lift their sword to re-engage. You can step back from Hidari Jodan and back in towards the center mutually and assume Chudan or Kamai. Make Kamai Otoku, 5 steps back, reassume Chudan, and you're good to go for Nanahon-me. So it's all about those key seme points, okay? That initial step in from Gedan with a slight lift, that's seme point number 1. The swift step in to threaten the kote against Jodan, that's seme point number 2. The Chudan situation where you overpressure kote to invite their kote strike, that's seme point 3. Nail those parts, get the footwork right, and the zanshin, and you're good to go. But this is a really, really good study of 2 players fighting for the sen, if that makes sense, trying to maintain the initiative. Shidachi's job is to keep the pressure on so that Uchidachi cannot recover the initiative. Okay, so that's the point of the kata. Okay, so Nanahon-me is the waza men nukido. Okay, so with nukido, the principle is that you invite an attack to a particular target, and once you get the opponent to commit to that target, you basically remove the target out of the way and counter strike in the same instant. So Uchidachi and Shidachi both set off in Chudan. 3 steps forward and meet in Isoku Itonomai. And Uchidachi initiates essentially sort of like a probe for ski, and it's basically eye ski, so it's a little bit different than in the earlier kata. So there's basically Uchidachi does a ski in a similar sort of fashion to Yohon-me, with a sort of rotation on the blade, but it's more in a way to kind of just push Shidachi's Kensen off center. Okay, it's not really going fully across to the ribs as such. It's still meant to be, as far as I know, a ski to solar plexus, but it's kind of the threat of ski. Shidachi steps back in okuriashi and also doesn't ski, but they do a kind of open hand technique but thrusting forward, and that's basically, it's this play over the center line. Okay, so the idea is that you nullify that ski and return to aichudan together, okay, mutually. Uchidachi then does something quite bold, which is to use sugiashi. Sugiashi, we're all taught in Kirikaeshi, is where, as a bad habit, if you do it as a habit, it's a bad thing. So it's basically where you bring the back foot up alongside the front foot and then launch your attack from there. But it is actually a legitimate form of footwork, and this kata shows you how, if you're going to use it, this is kind of the way you might go about using it. So essentially you have this eye ski situation, and there's a stalemate, and Uchidachi decides to break the stalemate by stepping through with the left and pushing Shidachi's Kensen out. Okay, so not harai, not slapping it, but just pushing it out momentarily, and essentially walking through with Ayumiashi on the second step and doing a large men cut, very similar to Ippon-me. Okay, but the footwork is slightly different. Okay, and the call for ya, so you make this opening, and then as you step through, it's ya. Okay, Shidachi should respond to this pressure, this attempt to push their Kensen out, as soon as the Uchidachi's bokuto starts to lift. In that instant, you should immediately step in and strike the door. Now, the footwork for Shidachi is quite interesting, and it's probably the biggest area that people struggle with, along with the timing. The key is you should aim to strike the door, and the timing of your door and their men should be the same. Okay, so as they go ya, it's yato together. Okay, really instantaneous. The footwork is really interesting for Shidachi because the back foot, the left foot, comes across in front of the right foot and is angled towards a new center line. So you're kind of twisting it towards your left. I would say about 45 degrees. Okay, it's quite extreme. And you're kind of parking it in between, like pointing your toes in towards the new center line you're about to create. Okay, this is quite tricky, so watch the video very carefully for this. But it's the hardest part of the kata, I think, for people to nail. The other thing is the way you cut the door. So a lot of people will lift up through the center and try to cut that textbook door where you only change the angle in front of your body. Nanahon-me is a bit different. So you're taking, as the men comes, you're taking your left foot, putting it out of center at that angle, and you should lift the bokuto where your head was. So as your feet move, this is the center line. As you make that step, you've brought your head out of center. That's the nuki bit, right? Where you've taken your head, your target away. In that instant, you need to have made that strike. Boom. Okay, so you're lifting up through center, but you're taking your head and your body out of that center line. Bang. Okay. If you lift like this and cut, you'll cut flat on the door. Okay, it'll make it worse. So be aware of that. Okay, and you need to make that really a sharp and shortcut with the attitude of, and don't be afraid to look at the door. So in that instant where you feel your Kensen being pushed out of center, as soon as the tension breaks and they lift, it's to, right? And forward with the cut, forward. Really important that you have this foot coming across, but the feeling is falling, almost falling forward onto that door cut. Okay, it's essential that you hit the door, not the front of the torso. This is really critical. From there, okay, the footwork is interesting because your feet are like this now. You're going to actually draw that back foot out and push okuriashi from what was your back foot that's come to the front at the angle. When your back leg comes out, you're going to push off from that foot, okay, okuriashi. That's going to give you the distance and slide down and take your knee. This point, your bokto should follow the line of the cut. So you cut, just touch the target, open, okay, go through, and then make the angle of the cut that you would have made for the door, and that should be your finishing position of the cut. Uchidachi at this point is looking away from you. When they re-establish eye contact, this is when you make wakigamai from that seated position. If you're unable to do the seated position, you can do this standing up. And the principle of the footwork is exactly the same, you just don't drop to your knee, okay? From there, if you've made your wakigamai, right? And when the uchidachi invites you, they will bring their bokto over in a generous motion to make eye chudan again. So you re-establish chudan from the ground. They will step back to draw you up. Try to make a little bit of semeyashi. When you step up, try not to let the connection break, okay? And step up together. And then when you rotate around, the key is just take your time, do small measured steps. Just try to get back in a measured, considered way where you still have zanshin. So you're still focused on the interaction. Don't let it be haphazard, okay? And if you rush, your footwork is going to get sloppy and unbalanced, okay? So just take your time. There's no rush to get back to center, okay? The key is, as I said, the timing of the waza and cutting the door forward, okay? This footwork needs to happen in an instant. So they break your center and to, and then push off and through. Okay, show your cutting angle. The blade is alongside you, basically in your center. Your left hand is in your center. And then when you get the eye contact, make wakigamai for zanshin. Establish chudan, stand up, go back to center, okay? So just okay, so the key is not waiting, and that's one of the big takeaways you can take from kata in general, particularly the later forms where you're dealing with a kind of ojiwaza counterattack. There's a lot to be learned about taking the sen, taking the initiative, so that you're presenting a certain kamai, right, to narrow down the places that your opponent can attack. So now you know roughly where they're going to strike. Then it's about employing your seme to control when they're going to attack. And obviously you select the right waza, perform it instantly. So it's got to be in ichibyoshi, timing of 1, right? That's critical. It's got to have kiken tai no ichi to make it a strong enough attack. You must demonstrate zanshin, all these things, okay? So when you're studying these in the kata, try to take this back into your shinai kendo, okay? So if you're particularly, say, shodan nidan, and you're really wanting to build your ojiwaza, these are the lessons I think that can really be valuable from the kendo kata that you can take back into your shinai kendo. You can think, well, how can I go about taking these principles and employing them? And it's not that you have to do everything verbatim, okay? But say you want to do a men nuki-do, try to think, well, I'm going to try things with my footwork and my seme to see if I can make them in jikeiko strike a men when I want them to strike a men. And maybe you get hit. That's okay. But if you get hit on the men, then you know, okay, I did something and it worked. Okay, so now how can I make the counterattack work against that? So keep trying at it. And obviously you want to do this every so often. You don't want to stick with the same attack again and again because your opponent's going to get wise to you. It's got to be a bit of a surprise when you try it. It's not going to be something that you conquer in a day. It's it could take years, right, for you to really make headway on any given waza. But that's the point, is to try to take those principles, keep them in your mind, and when you do your keiko in your bogu, don't do it without an aim. Okay, go in with some objectives. So maybe if you're fencing someone who's a lower level than you, might be a good case, say you're weak at kaishido. It's a good place to have the time and space to try your kaishido. Once you get reasonably confident doing against those sorts of level of opponent, then you need to start moving on to different things with that kind of opponent. So pick another waza that you're weak on and work on it with them. All the while you're still keeping your shikake-men, your debana-men, debana kote, your bread and butter techniques, you're keeping them sharp, right? So you practice those with everybody, particularly the highest level people that you fence, right? Particularly sensei and that sort of thing. You want to keep those bread and butter waza going, right? But your oji waza, the next thing though is, when you're reasonably confident, start deploying those against people who are the same level as you. And obviously when you start to get success with those, then you want to move on to a weaker waza that you've been working on with more beginner levels or lower levels than yourself, and then bring those into your keiko. So it's about being constructive in your keiko, thinking about it between sessions, going away, reflecting on it, and thinking, how can I make this better for myself? How can I extract the most out of my time in the dojo? So there's a lot that can be gained from practicing your kata this way. Now, I come from a dojo that is really, really into kata. We practice Riai, we practice Jodo. Our sister club practices Kenjutsu as well. So we have a slightly different take on this, and we prioritize kata probably a lot more than most dojo do. So you may not get to practice this all that often. Don't worry about it too much. In the context of Kendo, Shinai work is priority, okay? So, follow what your club is doing, follow what your sensei is showing you. But you'll always have something like this video to refer to. So even if you don't get to practice your kata often, hopefully I've given you some things and some context that when you do practice your kata, you can be quite constructive about it and extract quite a lot from your kata practice, even though you're not able to invest that much time in it, potentially. But otherwise, I do hope that it just at least helps you to progress, past a certain level. Like if you're finding that your kata is stagnant or you just want to make it sharper, hopefully this has given you some insights. Stay tuned for the next episode where we'll tackle Kodachi Ippon-me through Sanbon-me. And I'll see you guys next time. If you like the videos, like, share, subscribe, and do leave a comment. Thanks very much.